Good afternoon or good evening, everybody, and welcome to our MDA Advocacy Institute on supporting medical research funding. I will be your host for the next hour, which we're going to be together. I am Paul Melmeyer. I'm the Executive Vice President of Public Policy and Advocacy here at MDA, and I'm very much looking forward to the hour ahead as we talk about how we all collectively can support our medical research ecosystem. So let's talk first, just a couple housekeeping items to go over. For one, if you would like to use closed captioning, you can go to the bottom left of your screen and click that little bubble with the CC there. Click that for closed captioning. Now, if you would like to ask questions of myself, my co-panelist Sean, you can best do so by going to the bottom right of your screen where you'll see those three little dots and you can find the Q&A box there. That's the best way to be sending questions into us. And as the hour is going along, we're going to have a dedicated time to answer any questions that you have at the end of our hour. But also we might be answering some questions you may have as we go along. So feel free to put them in that Q&A box whenever you would like. We are also recording this webinar, so if you don't catch every word or if you have to run off a little bit early due to another commitment, please feel free to keep an eye on MDA's YouTube channel as well as our mda.org/advocacy webpage where we post our advocacy institutes to catch anything that you happen to miss. So with that, let's move to the next slide and let's talk about what we are going to be talking about this evening. And it's really just going to be focused on medical research and how we collectively can strive for a well-funded and secure medical research ecosystem. We'll start with the welcome I'm doing right now, and I'll reintroduce myself and my co-panelist Sean here in a second. And then we're going to get into a little bit on NIH-funded research and neuromuscular diseases, the function of the NIH, how NIH funds neuromuscular disease research, and then what's on the table. Why are we talking about this tonight, this Tuesday evening of all evenings? Why is this a relevant and topical thing for us to be talking about right now? We'll go through the various different proposals for the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, and the implications of if those proposals actually were enacted. From there, we're going to talk about our campaign, a campaign that we're going to be launching this month on supporting medical research funding. And from there, we'll be talking about how you and your voice will be incredibly important in making sure that the NIH stays well funded and that our neuromuscular disease research ecosystem stays well funded. And then we'll tell you what comes next from there. We'll give you some immediate opportunities for action as well as a preview of what's to come a little ways down the road. And then we'll close with answering any questions that you have for us on medical research. And if we have time, anything that's on your mind, public policy or advocacy-wise, we'll do our best to answer your questions there as well. So let's move to the next slide. It will be two of us joining you today with the microphone. As I already said, I'm Paul Melmeyer, the Executive Vice President of Public Policy and Advocacy here at MDA. And I'm very pleased to be joined by Sean Hill, who is MDA's Manager of Public Policy and Advocacy. I'm going to be focusing tonight primarily on the policy and legislative aspects of NIH funding and its importance to our neuromuscular disease research ecosystem. And then I'll be turning it to Sean, who's going to be talking about the campaign that we have planned, everything that's going to go into it, and the importance of your voice within ensuring medical research stays well funded. So with that, without further ado, why don't we move into the first part of our contents on NIH funding. And as you've heard, I've really been kind of emphasizing NIH, and I should say that much, if not all, of what we're going to be talking about tonight is NIH focused, the National Institutes of Health. Now, there are other agencies in the federal government that fund neuromuscular disease research. For example, there's the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program at the Department of Defense, which funds about $10 million of Duchenne muscular dystrophy research and $40 million of ALS research each year, as well as the FDA that funds research through its Orphan Product Grants Program, as well as its Rare Neurodegenerative Disease Grants Program. and the National Science Foundation as well, and others that are instrumental in funding early stage researchers. But it's without question that the NIH is by far the largest funder of neuromuscular disease medical research. It's not even close. Just to give you some context, we at MDA were very pleased that we hold second place in the running for funding neuromuscular disease medical research over the last 75 years, as we have funded over $1 billion of neuromuscular disease research in our history. But just compare that to what NIH funded in fiscal year 2024 alone. And that would have been October 2023 through September 2024. In that 12-month span, NIH funded $234 million in ALS research, and that amounted to 299 different projects. It funded $88 million in muscular dystrophy research projects, and that was spread across 214 different research projects. $16 million in spinal muscular atrophy research projects across 27 different projects. And then if you zoom out even further and just look at rare diseases more broadly, $6.8 billion of NIH's research funding went to rare disease research. So as you can see, we're talking about a scale that is entirely different, entirely bigger than anything any nonprofit such as MDA can fund, or any other federal agency or state agency for that matter, or the private sector by and large. NIH is unique, really across the entire world, in just how much medical research it's able to fund, and that includes within neuromuscular diseases. So that's why NIH funding is so important. That's why we place such an emphasis on NIH funding, and we're asking you to place an emphasis on NIH funding. On the right side of your screen, you can see a graph that I pulled from NIH's website that shows the amount of funding in muscular dystrophies that they have done annually over the course of the last 17 years or so. And you can see that it's held steady around 70 to 80 million or so, with some bumps in 2020, and see actually the trajectory going up, and way back in 2008 it was below 60. So that's a pretty good increase. Would love to see it higher than that. And that can be a conversation perhaps for another time, but at the very least you can see just annually how dedicated NIH is to funding muscular dystrophy research. So let's move to the next slide. So now that I hope that I've convinced you that NIH funding is very important to our community and to the neuromuscular disease research ecosystem more broadly, let me spend a minute on why we're talking about this right now. The reason that we're talking about this right now is because government funding for the NIH and any other institute or agency for that matter expires on September 30th. So that's just 2 weeks away from today. At midnight on Tuesday of 2 weeks from now, so when the clock strikes midnight on October 1st, if you will, funding expires for the NIH and any other federal agency by and large. And so that means that Congress right now is actively discussing a number of different proposals for NIH's funding. That includes kind of a status quo approach in which they just take NIH's previous funding numbers, erase the previous deadline of September 30th, and write the next deadline in and just say, whatever NIH was doing before, they're going to keep doing it. And that would be the approach of a continuing resolution, more or less. There's also a proposal from the administration, which would actually substantially reduce NIH funding. We'll get back into that a little bit more because there's more to that proposal beyond just the funding reductions. Now, more recently, the Senate and the House of Representatives have each released their own proposals for how to fund the NIH and also address some other aspects of the policy that governs NIH. And there are some similarities between the two proposals. There are some differences between the two proposals. And we'll get back to that here in a second. But what we expect is that this month, by that September 30th deadline, Congress probably is not going to choose one of the bigger, kind of more substantial year-long proposals. They're probably not going to be choosing the administration's proposal. They're not going to be choosing the House or the Senate's proposal. And that's because they need more time to negotiate not only specifically the NIH funding aspects of the different proposals that are out there, but literally everything else. Everything when it comes to government funding, more or less, is on the table. And so they need some more time. So what we're expecting is that they're going to pass a continuing resolution at the end of this month. That is, of course, if Republicans and Democrats in the Senate and the House can agree on a continuing resolution. That's a big if. We'll see. But if they are to pass anything this month, it would be a continuing resolution that would probably extend our current approach just a little ways further into the fall. There's a proposal out there right now that would extend the deadline to November 22nd, I believe. And there might be some other similar deadlines proposed, but more or less that is what we would expect. And that means that by mid-November, that is when Congress would be hoping to choose one of these bigger proposals for NIH funding that will really govern the extent and the process and the methods in which NIH can fund neuromuscular disease research for the next year. And that's why this is so important today, and it's going to remain important the rest of this month, probably into October and into November. And that's why it's a very salient and very current thing to be talking about. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. And this is where I'm going to kind of compare and contrast the different proposals that are out there, just so you can see some of the differences, some of the similarities between some of the different proposals. And then I'm going to close by telling you what we want to see happen as well, because we'd love to have our own proposal considered, and we have written to Congress to tell them what we think that they should do, including among these proposals, but just by and large, even if these handful of proposals weren't on the table. But let's talk about what's happening right now. So how is NIH currently funded? So the NIH is funded at approximately $48.4 billion a year, a fiscal year. And they distribute that money across 27 different institutes and centers, as well as ARPA-H. The 27 institutes and centers, these are divided by body system, I think by and large, as well as some other centers that specialize in some certain areas, such as in minority health or women's health or things of that nature. But otherwise, there's the National Institute of Neurological Disease and Stroke, and that's the institute that by and large does much of the funding for neurological diseases, including neuromuscular diseases. There's the National Cancer Institute. There's the National Institute on Arthritic and Musculoskeletal and Skin Diseases, NIAMS. That's another institute that funds a lot of muscular dystrophy research. And so these 27 institutes and centers will be funded specifically by a continuing resolution or by whatever Congress chooses to move forward with. Now, ARPA-H is actually a new center, very new compared to many of the institutes and centers, in that it is affiliated with the NIH, but it is technically not one of the institutes and centers. And ARPA-H was created only in the last 5 years. It was created in the previous administration to really pursue that kind of high-risk, high-reward type medical research. And in doing so, they're also structured very differently. They're not structured like NIH institutes and centers are structured, nor are they structured in the ways in which they actually give grants and give funding. But they are one of the newest outfits in the federal government looking to fund neuromuscular disease research, or any medical research for that matter, and they're included within this figure. So that's kind of the top line funding for the NIH. Now, also what the NIH does is that as part of the grants that they give out, there are generally two different features that I want to highlight, because these two features are under discussion right now in policy circles. The first is that the institute that's receiving that funding will negotiate with the Department of Health and Human Services, that's HHS, on the amount of additional grant funding that NIH will give to cover the indirect costs of research, such as paying the electric bill, paying the janitors to clean the labs, paying the HR departments, things such as that by and large, that contributes to ensuring the research can continue, but isn't necessarily the specific costs of research, such as buying the beakers and the test tubes and the things of that nature. So right now that's negotiated on an institution by institution basis, on a grant by grant basis at times. Now, also, most grants are multi-year, which means that university, I'm here in Silver Spring, Maryland, so let's say Johns Hopkins University, a little ways down the street from me, will receive a grant from the NIH, And that grant will likely be over multiple years, just because in order to be able to complete the stipulations of the grant, it's not going to be done in a calendar year. It's going to be done over several years. But how that is funded by and large is on a year-by-year basis. So even if the NIH awards a grant to Johns Hopkins for 3 years, it's going to pay Johns Hopkins for the first year of the grant this year, second year of the grant next year, the third year of the grant, and the third year. And this is a way in which NIH is able to commit to funding institutions for multiple years, but spread out the funding that they have across more grants. And we'll get back to why that's important here in a moment. So that's kind of in many ways the status quo of how the NIH has historically operated. And if a continuing resolution was to be passed, much of that would continue going forward, not all of it. Because let's move on to the next slide. This is where we get into what the administration is proposing for the NIH. And this comes from the annual budget that the president and the administration publishes each year and then provides to Congress. This is essentially the administration's proposal for how they believe that the federal government should be funded. And there are a number of pretty substantial changes to the NIH that the administration is proposing. For one, the administration proposes to pretty dramatically reduce the amount of annual funding in which the NIH would receive. That the NIH would receive in this coming fiscal year $27.5 billion in funding rather than the $48.5 billion in funding that the NIH currently receives. That's about a 40% decrease in funding. Now, additionally, what this proposal would do would be to consolidate the institutes and centers into 8 different institutes rather than the current 27. That isn't every single institute. There would still be some that would remain essentially the same as they are right now, but there would be many others that would be combined. For example, the National Institute of Neurological Disease and Stroke, NINDS, could be combined into a handful of other institutes, such as the Dental Institute, and I believe the institute that focuses on eye and eyesight research. And then the National Institute of Arthritic and Musculoskeletal and Skin Diseases, NIAMS, would also be combined into some other body system institutions. There would even be others that would be removed from the NIH entirely and actually be sent over to other areas of the federal government. So a pretty substantial change to the NIH is what the administration is proposing. The administration also proposes a very hard cap on indirect cost coverage at 15% of the grants. As I mentioned previously, these indirect costs are negotiated by and large by institutions in the federal government, and they can range anywhere from 10 to 15% all the way up to much higher than that, 40, 50, 60% even at times. And this proposal, which has already been attempted to be implemented by the administration, but was stayed by the federal court system, this budget proposal would solidify that in law and would permit the NIH to proceed with that hard cap on indirect cost coverage. Now, another thing I want to mention is that there would be much greater use of the forward funding of grants. Now, what this means, this isn't to harken back just to a minute or two ago when I described how a 3-year grant is funded over 3 years, essentially, that this would instead fund that 3-year grant all at the same time, all at the start. So rather than it being divided into 3 and over 3 years, this institution receive most, if not all, of their money up front. Now, that might seem rather inconsequential to many. Why would that really matter? Well, that matters because if the NIH is giving an institute year 2 and year 3 of its money in year 1, that means there's a lot less year 1 money to be spread around. There's going to be a lot fewer grants that are actually going to be funded in a fiscal year. And that is actually being implemented right now at the NIH. And that's why the 2 graphs on the right side of your screen are important. So take a look at the top one. This comes from Stat News. Credit to Stat News. Thank you for these graphs. They were very illustrative. The top graph shows that even though there was a bit of a slowdown in the pace at which NIH was funding research this year, via a flurry of funding in August and this month in September, they've actually caught up to the pace in which the NIH averages in its grant funding over the previous, 9 fiscal years. And so, as you can see, that bottom line was lagging behind, but now it's caught up. In fact, now it's just a little bit ahead of the average pace. But look at the bottom graph. These are two specific grants, R01 and R21 grants, and this is where I'm going to get out of my depth to explain what specifically these grants are, but they're two of the most common kinds of grants that the NIH gives. And you can see that the number of grants are lagging dramatically far behind the average. On average, I'm going to squint to read this figure. On average, by this time in a fiscal year, the NIH would have funded 5,634 grants or so. At this point this year, the NIH has funded only 3,758. So that shows that even though they're spending the same amount of money, that money isn't being spread out to researchers and institutions and really worthy research. It's being really focused and consolidated into specific projects so they get their funding up front, and consequently there's much fewer research actually being funded. So this is of great concern, and this is something that I'll come back to and something we're hoping will be addressed. But this is a policy change of the NIH that could contribute to a lot less research being funded, as it appears it is doing this year in 2025. So let's move forward. Let's go beyond the administration's proposal and let's head to Congress. Let's see what they're up to over there. The first body of Congress that got their proposal out the door was the Senate, and specifically the Senate Committee on Appropriations. It was back in July when the Senate Committee on Appropriations proposed that NIH should receive $48.8 billion in funding. And this is actually a $400 million increase over its current level of funding, which is good news. At the same time, this committee rejected the proposed consolidation. They were not interested in following the administration's proposal to consolidate NIH into 8 different institutes and actually jettison some institutes from there. Now, within that $48.8 billion in NIH funding, there was also good news specifically for neuromuscular disease research. For example, for the very first time in its 5-year history, the Act for ALS would be fully funded at the $100 million authorization level that it was first authorized at. Previously, Act for ALS was funded at about $75 to $80 million a year. This would bring it to $100 million. Additionally, there's $40 million additional dollars for medical research for ALS within the bill, including $30 million of high-risk, high-reward research at ARPA-H, that agency I already mentioned earlier, as well as $10 additional million for the National Institutes of Neurological Disease and Stroke to fund additional ALS research from there. There was $10 million more for the Rare Disease Clinical Research Network. That's the RDCRN acronym there. Through that network, there's funding for hereditary neuropathies and mitochondrial diseases and other neuromuscular conditions, and more. There was additional increases in funding included within this proposal specifically for neuromuscular diseases, which we are very thrilled to see. This proposal also rejected the 15% indirect cost cap that the administration has proposed, and also actually prohibited the greater use of the forward funding mechanism that I just explained on the previous slide. Instead, what this proposal does is it would tell the administration you can't increase the percentage of grants that use forward funding. It would limit what the administration is able to do beyond what it has already done. And what it would do is also open up the conversation for if 15% is not the right approach for indirect costs, if our current approach is not the right approach, which actually a lot of people acknowledge that our current approach to covering indirect costs and grants might still not be the best approach. Let's actually have a full discussion on what is, come together and develop the appropriate policy for the way forward for indirect costs. Now, this proposal passed very bipartisanly. It passed 26-3 out of the Senate Appropriations Committee. So as you can see, there was lots of support for the NIH in particular, as well as other parts of the federal government that were also in this bill that we don't have time to get to tonight. But you can see that it was a very bipartisan proposal. So now let's move over to the House side. More recently, and this was just in the last couple of weeks, the House Appropriations Committee released its proposal. And what the House Appropriations Committee proposes is $48.1 billion in NIH funding. So that's approximately $30 million less than what the NIH is currently receiving. And that's it's not all just kind of being spread out across the NIH. In fact, the 27 institutes and centers are proposed to see a funding increase, a small one, but a funding increase as part of this proposal. And really, it is ARPA-H that would bear the brunt of the decrease. In fact, ARPA-H would lose almost $600 million in funding, whereas NIH, the other 27 institutes, would actually see their funding go up by about $300 million. Now, included within this proposal is a full $80 million for Act for ALS, so not the 100 that we saw in the Senate, but still pretty good. That's every bit as much, if not actually a little bit more, than what has generally speaking been appropriated for Act for ALS. There would be another $10 million in additional ALS research funding, and a lot of instructions as well within the House Appropriations Committee's report language. That's basically all the notes that they hand over to the agency to say, hey, all that money we're giving you, this is how we want you to spend it. Within those notes, they stipulate that they want ALS to be prioritized. They want muscular dystrophies, in particular Becker and Duchenne muscular dystrophy, to be prioritized, as well as other neuromuscular diseases. I believe limb-girdle muscular dystrophy is mentioned. Mitochondrial diseases have their own byline as well, technically within there. So a lot of good instructions we see within that proposal. Also, the House Appropriations Committee also rejected the proposed consolidation, and they specifically addressed that within the report language I just referenced. There they say that they believe that's the job of the authorizing committee within Congress. And just to kind of do a little quick legislative civics 101 as a reminder, there's the authorizers and there's the appropriators within Congress. The authorizers tell the agencies what to do. The appropriators give the agencies the funding to do it. And so the appropriators here, probably pretty appropriately, think that to actually reorganize the entire NIH, that's a job for the authorizing committees, in this case the Energy and Commerce Committee, rather than those who hold the power of the purse, the appropriators. Now, this proposal, as far as I could tell, does not address the indirect cost issue nor the forward funding of grants. And this proposal did not have a bipartisan vote. It did have a partisan vote. Republicans voted for it, Democrats voted against it. But by and large, the reason for that was because of other aspects of the bill funding other parts of the Department of Health and Human Services. Aspects including a $2 billion cut to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's budget, or eliminating the Agency for Health Research and Quality entirely. Things that Democrats weren't in favor of, Republicans were, which led to a partisan vote. But by and large, it wasn't because of NIH issues. The NIH proposal within was actually pretty well bipartisanly supported. So I've now kind of walked you through the different things that are on the table. Let me finish before handing it over to Sean on what we want to see as part of all of this. And that's on the next slide. So what we are asking Congress to do is to pass NIH funding at least the levels proposed by the Senate. And I can tell you actually that's a bit of a consolation. What we had originally wanted Congress to move forward with is a $51 billion funding of NIH, because historically NIH funding has been incredibly bipartisan, and we've seen in these appropriations deals the NIH's budget increasing by about $2 billion a year. That's been true for much of the last 15 years. And so to see the Senate propose a $400 million increase, that's better than any of the other approaches. That's better than any of the other proposals put forward, but it's still not exactly what we want. So that's why we're saying let's have the Senate as the baseline, have NIH funding at least levels proposed by the Senate. In addition, we want this to happen quickly. We don't want there to be these short month-long or 2-month-long punts that continue to happen, and so we don't actually get this big budget and this disagreement that we really need for the NIH, and that we also reiterate to, thankfully, each of the proposals on Congress does reiterate that a reorganization, a massive reorganization of the NIH is not to be done through the appropriations process. It's to be done through the authorizing committees. We also call for a rejection of the flat 15% cap on indirect costs, as well as a rejection of the increased use of forward funding of grants. So we see a lot of that within, especially the Senate proposal, some of that within the House proposal. And so what we now want to do, though, in partnership with many of our sister organizations, you see many of them actually joined a letter that we sent on some of these issues back in the late winter, and that's where that image of all of our logos comes from on the right side of your screen. But also with our partners in the research field, in medical institutions at universities. But our most important our most important partner throughout all of this is going to be you. So that's why we're translating all of this into our Support Medical Research Funding campaign that we're launching very shortly. And with that, I'm very pleased to hand it over to Sean Hill, who's going to tell you a little bit more about our campaign. Sean.
Thank you, Paul. Paul has done a fabulous job of kind of laying the foundation. We've gained a historical context. We certainly understand where we are now and what's on the table in terms of the administration and Congress. But having garnered all that knowledge, the question then becomes, well, what do we do with it? And in MDA's eyes, we are always proactive. So we say, let's put it into action. So this month we are launching a campaign around NIH funding for medical research. Part of the aim is to create a sense of awareness, particularly among legislators, of the human impact on research. We often talk about science and economics, but very rarely do legislators get to hear and understand the human component. Our goal is to protect and strengthen NIH funding for the neuromuscular disease community. We're going to intend to do that by influencing policymakers through robust and coordinated advocacy and ensuring continued progress throughout the research progression, not only the introduction of new therapies and new drugs, but assuring that researchers have adequate funds to carry out these life-saving discoveries they may be making. Next slide. Okay, so what do you expect to see from our campaign? Lots of things. In the coming weeks, you'll start to see visual and digital tools in which you can engage. There will be videos, toolkits, social media content. There will be educational materials, and there'll be media outreach that you'll see by way of op-eds, social media posts, and certainly digital amplification. I encourage all to stay tuned because there's lots of exciting things coming down the pike. Next slide, please. Okay, but how can you get involved? The campaign engagement requires your interaction. As I mentioned a moment ago, lawmakers hear from universities, they hear from research institutions, but there's a piece of that puzzle that's missing that they often don't get. And again, that's the human component. And that is where you come in. We're urging all to contact your legislators, whether that's by email or phone, or certainly a visit if you're able to do so. We encourage you to pick up the mantle and pass it on to others in the community, friends, family, neighbors. It takes, as they say, out of many voices, one, and that collective voice indeed makes a difference. I encourage you to become the face and the story of research. Next slide, please. You've often heard in other campaigns, and certainly among MDA, the power of a personal story. And that is so evident. Think about us in general as human beings and our love for episodic television. We're drawn in. We like that human component. And that's what we're asking you to do here in terms of sharing your story. Legislators can get numbers, they can get stats, piles upon piles of bill text. But in some respects, that's abstract. That's the kind of over here thing. But there's nothing more powerful than lived experience. It makes the issue real. it humanizes it, and it lets legislators see themselves, their family members, in the stories that you tell. Personal stories help break through the noise. And in that breaking through the noise, you get through to people's hearts and minds. A compelling story is often what moves a legislator to act. They may walk away from a meeting full of facts and figures that they may or may not remember, but they will remember the story that you have told. If you could go to the next slide, please. So just want to offer a couple of takeaways before we get ready to bring things to a close. This is a now issue. As Paul pointed out earlier, Congress is debating these issues now. This isn't a further down the line. The issue is now. Decisions are being made now, so we must act now. NIH funding is the cornerstone for developing therapies that will benefit the neuromuscular disease community. So this isn't an ethereal issue out in the sky somewhere. This is the cornerstone of how we get to drugs and therapies that could lead to a better way of life for our community. So I encourage all to join the campaign. I encourage you to be the bridge that links research to lived experience. Only you know your story, only you can articulate it, and only you can articulate it in a way that resonates with legislators and they act accordingly. So finally, I guess I'm encouraging all to take the message to Capitol Hill, emphasize no cuts, secure funding, and to hopefully create an environment for much more robust funding for research. So with that being said, I'm going to turn the floor back over to Paul for our call to action and to open up the floor for a little Q&A. Paul?
Thank you, Sean. That was excellently said, and hopefully gets us all excited to be contacting our lawmakers. And the good news, if you move to the next slide, and as I've seen in the chat, we have made it easy for you, in that we have a new action alert within our webpage to contact your representatives, to contact your senators as soon as you are ready to do so. So what we would encourage you to do is follow the link in the chat, and my colleague Mark will be putting that link in the chat here any second. But another place you can go is votervoice.net/MDA/home. That's actually where we have all of our current action alerts, but this one will be right up there towards the top. And you can find it there in case you can't quite get to the URL that Mark did just put in the chat. Thank you, Mark. And you know, Sean, I think, said it absolutely best. So I'm just going to reiterate just a handful of things that she said as you're thinking about contacting your senators and your representative. We have a bit of a template within the letter there, but please do personalize the letter with your thoughts, your stories, your experiences. As Sean has said, what is going to resonate with lawmakers is not the facts and figures about specific amounts of funding or economic arguments. You know, those are all important. I'm not wanting to downplay those. What they're really going to remember are the hopes that you may have for a treatment for yourself or for a loved one or the next generation of individuals with the disease in which you advocate for, and how that treatment may depend on progress in medical research that the NIH is funding. What they're going to want to hear and what is going to resonate with them is how their neighbor down the streets or the person that they know who grew up with their cousin or whatever perhaps connection you may have with your lawmaker, even if it's 2 or 3 degrees away, that they are depending on them. And in many ways, potentially their health is depending on them to actually support a strong NIH funding proposal. So personalize those letters with your thoughts, your stories, your experiences, the disease in question that you might be advocating for, and specifically why NIH funding is important to you. as I kind of already referenced, don't be afraid to add some kind of local or state anecdotes. Talk about why medical research funding is important in your community or in your state or in your city, why the university down the road is conducting cutting edge research in your disease or the disease in which you could be interested in. Or if it's an institution in which perhaps you're close with the researchers or you go to that care center and you know that they also conduct research, talk about them and how they are kind of really on the edge of medical discovery when it comes to the neuromuscular disease in question. And make your expectations very clear to them that you are expecting them to prioritize a strong medical research ecosystem with strong NIH funding within the appropriations that they are considering right now. So this is our call to action for you. Please do email your representative through this and your senators as soon as you can. And to Sean's point from a couple slides ago, this is just the beginning. We're going to have a lot more opportunities for you over the course of the next several weeks into next month and maybe a little bit beyond there. In yes, emailing your representatives and senators, but maybe also calling or participating in days of action, and other opportunities that we're going to be putting forward. So with that, I have been seeing some excellent questions being placed in the Q&A box, and I saw, I think, a handful in the chat as well. I'm going to start with the Q&A, but I will reiterate once again that if you have any questions or comments on what we've been talking about thus far this evening, please feel free to put them, especially in the Q&A, but pose them in any way that you can. And we're going to get to as many of these prior to the end of our hour before we close for this evening. So the first question I see here comes from Steve. Steve asks, what can Congress do, regardless of NIH funding level, to prevent the administration from just cutting funding unilaterally? And this is something that we have been concerned with over the course of 2025, where we have seen the administration choose not to actually spend appropriated dollars that Congress has appropriated. And this has engendered many different debates. It has engendered many different lawsuits in which those who were supposed to be receiving these appropriated dollars have sued the federal government for not actually spending the dollars that Congress appropriated. Now, many believe that the administration or any administration doesn't have the power to decide just not to spend appropriated dollars, and that has not been fully adjudicated yet in the courts. That has been working its way, that's been working its way through the courts, and I do believe the Supreme Court is set to likely hear arguments on this very issue over the next couple of months. But while that has all been happening, nonetheless, I showed the graph from earlier in my slides in which it showed that the NIH actually has spent the same average amount of funding as it had at this point last year or in previous years. And I highlight that because while the NIH had lagged behind for a while, and that was because it did appear as if the administration was going to try to not spend the dollars that had been appropriated to the NIH, in the end, by and large, they have. And that is for a couple of different reasons. For one, there has been bipartisan outreach to the administration, asking them to spend every penny in NIH research that was appropriated by Congress. That includes a letter sent by 14 different Republican senators asking the administration to spend all of the NIH funding. That also includes additional pressure from constituents and congresspeople and elsewhere that resulted in the administration in August announcing that it would be allowing NIH to spend all the money that had been appropriated. So we're hopeful and we're expecting that by the end of September, we will actually see NIH having spent all of that money. So the final point I want to make is that even though it appears as if the administration will spend all of its NIH money, and that may be true in other research institutes as well, that doesn't necessarily mean that Congress has been happy with what the administration has been doing. In fact, within the Senate appropriations proposal, which I've been talking about as well as the others, but specifically within the Senate proposal, there is also language that puts further guardrails around the federal government, or specifically the Department of Health and Human Services, having to spend the money that is appropriated by Congress. So Congress is also paying attention and wanting to do something about this, at least on the Senate side. So that's a couple things I would say there about what Congress is doing, what the courts are doing, and what has been happening over the course of this last year. So I'm going to move on to a question from Shelley. And Shelley asks, has the NIH been fundamentally involved with the research on some of the newer treatment medications for those with neuromuscular conditions, or are the studies that develop those treatments primarily privately funded by pharmaceutical companies? That is such an excellent question, Shelley. And that is, your mind is going exactly where our mind is going, which is, can we actually point to NIH research dollars contributing to the treatments that are now available to many folks with neuromuscular diseases that are having a real impact on their health today? The answer is yes. NIH research has been foundational to advances in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, to advances in ALS, to advances in myasthenia gravis, in a number of different diseases, whether it be specific to that disease or more broadly. For example, NIH research has been instrumental in gene therapy development, broadly speaking. And so even if NIH might not have contributed to a specific study that led to the specific gene therapy for the specific disease, we wouldn't have gene therapies today if it wasn't for NIH research funding contributing to the gene therapy field. In addition to that, there have been specific therapies that, while they are developed by a private pharmaceutical company, the NIH is unable to develop therapies themselves. They can fund the basic and translational research, and in some cases, they can actually take a treatment all the way up to a phase 2 clinical trial. Nonetheless, they themselves aren't developing a therapy. From there, it has to be taken up largely by a private biopharmaceutical company and taken across the finish line. But all of that work that happens beforehand, especially in the basic and translational side of it, in finding the animal models or the non-animal models, researching the mechanisms of the disease, researching the mechanisms of prospective treatments. A lot of that is, in fact, the vast majority of that is funded by the NIH. So 100% Shelley, many, if not most, and I think there's even an argument for all of the treatments that are available to those with neuromuscular diseases today are available because, at least in some, if not large part, because of NIH funding. Okay. I'm going to take one more question in the Q&A. I'm seeing some great stuff happening in the chat. I'm going to head there in just a second, but I'm going to take another question in the Q&A before heading over there, and that's from Lynn. Lynn asks, are you tracking the Department of Defense congressionally directed medical research program? And the answer is yes. That the Department of Defense, as I mentioned previously, kind of at the outset, which is why we're so focused on NIH today, but the Department of Defense also has a medical research program, and they fund $40 million of ALS research in a fiscal year, and anywhere from $10 to $12.5 million of Duchenne research each year. And they also have the ability to fund research in a handful of other diseases, including mitochondrial diseases, myotonic dystrophy, and a few other neuromuscular conditions. And the proposals that we see in Congress are nearly uniform. In the Senate, they're proposing to still fund ALS research by $40 million, and then Duchenne research by $12.5 million for the next fiscal year. And the House, it's very similar, just a little bit different. The House is proposing, again, $40 million in ALS research and $10 million in Duchenne research, so just a few $1 million less. But nonetheless, pretty strong funding proposals. Those are flat funding. That's not what we always want to see. We want to see increases. But in the environment in that we are in, flat funding of these programs is not the absolute worst. So that is what we're seeing in those programs for ALS, as well as for Duchenne and some other neuromuscular conditions. All right, so I'm going to head over to the chat box and see what's happening over here. I'm seeing a lot of great comments, a lot of commentary on the work that we're all doing together here, as well as ways in which everybody can be involved. Let me see if I can pull out a good question here. There is a question from Liz talking about what is realistic to advocate for. Because it can be very important in kind of framing one's ask and what is realistic. Sean, I'm going to start with the nitty gritty, if you will, and then maybe if you want to add in how an advocate can frame kind of a realistic ask to a legislator, I'll turn it to you from there. But as I mentioned earlier, ideally we would love to see an increase in funding beyond what is being proposed by the Senate this year. But it doesn't appear as if that's going to happen. And so that's why we're asking for at least a baseline of what the Senate has proposed. The Senate has the strongest proposal out there between the House and certainly the administration. And that's why we're saying let's start at that as a baseline. We'd love to go higher than that. We're not giving up on higher than that. But if we're having to be realistic, we'll start there as a baseline. So Sean, if you're an advocate talking with a legislator and trying to remain realistic, I guess you could say, what would you advise our advocates to be thinking about as they're doing so?
Well, I hear you about being realistic. I think I would almost approach it from a two-prong approach. I think that I would share that ideally this is what we'd like to see in terms of increased funding, but then be honest enough to share, but realistically, we certainly understand that that may not be a possibility. So given that, we would like to see this baseline, and that would be the bare minimum. Certainly emphasizing that under no circumstances would we want to see any funding cut. But I think it's quite all right to put the kind of balloon up in the sky and then kind of bringing it down a notch or two and then discussing kind of what's a more realistic approach.
That's very well said, Sean. And I think as a community, we have the right to be aspirational. We have the right to be asking more from our Congress than maybe what is politically reasonable right now. But at the same time, we understand the dynamics that Congress is dealing with, and we can still speak their language of what they're dealing with in this moment. So I think you're absolutely spot on there, Sean, and hopefully that answers the question well for our attendees. I have a question from Dan here, and this is Dan asking, can you talk a bit about the various Wellstone centers for muscular dystrophy and how their funding is proceeding? So just to level set on what the Wellstone centers are, these are centers that are funded and created by the MD Care Act, which was first passed in 2001 and actually updated about 10 years ago at this point. And what these centers are, they're funded by the NIH to kind of specialize in muscular dystrophy research and care. They're funded by a couple of different institutes. I believe NINDS, the National Institute of Neurological Diseases and Stroke, have some of the Wellstone centers under their purview, and then the National Institute of Arthritic, Musculoskeletal, and Skin Diseases, NIAMS, has some under their purview. So last we checked in, we were under the understanding that the NINDS Wellstone centers either at that point or very shortly would receive their full funding, and that they were feeling pretty confident that over at NIAMS they would as well. Now, we haven't independently confirmed that, but we do believe each of the Wellstone centers should be receiving their full year funding. If not already, they will hear very shortly. So I'm Dan, I'll say I'm 90% sure there. I don't want to say I'm 100% sure, but I'm 90% sure they're all set. And I think, frankly, we probably would have heard if they weren't. But maybe this will be my impetus to go independently verify that. And Dan, if I hear back anything differently, I will reach out and I'll let you know. Okay, so let's move on. I know we have just 5 minutes left in our hour together. So let's see if we can finish strong here. Excellent comment, Patricia, on participating in Hill Days. Very glad to see that Limb-Girdle on the Hill that happened in the last week or so went very well. And it is a great indication on how participating in contacting one's congressperson, either in person or virtually, really is such an important part of the process. And glad to see a lot of folks in the comments are chatting about how they have been meeting with their congresspersons. Omar, you've had a couple really good comments on NIH's importance, not just for kind of basic and translational medical research, but also research into caring for muscular dystrophies and other neuromuscular diseases. It's not just about treatment development, it's also about improving the care for those with neuromuscular diseases. That is absolutely correct. And how also NIH can provide startup funding for small biotech companies that are trying to develop therapies for rare disorders. Just goes to show how variable and important NIH funding is, not just for kind of the classic examples that we might think of, but for those that we might not. As Omar, you're giving an excellent point for those as well. So I think I am done and looking at the chat. Let me just take one more look at the Q&A, and I know we have 4 minutes left, so maybe we can take one, maybe two more questions. I see Stephen, you're asking for more information on the Senate NIH proposal. Yep, I can follow up with you on that. I'll make a note of that. And then Mary asks, in which appropriation committee does the $100 million for Act for ALS come from? Is it LHHS, or is it some of the funding coming out of Ag FDA? You're speaking the appropriations acronyms here, Mary. You're speaking my language, which I appreciate. Just to clarify of what LHHS and Ag FDA means in this context, the Labor, Health, and Human Services Bill is one of the appropriations bills. That's LHHS. The Agriculture/FDA bill is another of the appropriations bills. So Mary, to answer your question, it's coming from the Senate Appropriations Committee, and it's the LHHS bills, Labor H. We would love to see additional funding within the FDA portion of the Ag FDA bill for Act for ALS. And actually, there have been only $5 million in some past years the FDA gets to spend on Act for ALS funding. But for the FY26 proposal from the Senate, that $100 million is entirely within the Labor HHS appropriations bill. So with that, I think we might have ran out of questions to answer this evening, and look at that, we're 2 minutes ahead of schedule. So why don't we just close it there, because I know we've covered a lot this evening, and I really appreciate everyone taking the time to join us tonight. Know that you're going to be hearing a lot more from us over the next couple of months on ways to get involved in supporting a strong neuromuscular disease medical research ecosystem. And we've already given you your starting point. That's that take action page to email your representative and your senators as soon as you are able to. So with that, I will wish you all a very good rest of your Tuesday evening, and thank you again for joining us.